Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 105, Meno 82b to c. Meno thought that he could sit back and enjoy a demonstration, but Socrates is having none of that. He has told Meno to hold forth his nous, to activate the thinking part of his brain, of his soul actually, but we would say brain. And now it's time to see what Socrates wants Meno to think about while watching the demonstration. Prosegedeto nun hopoteran soi faine tai animimnes gomenos manthanon par emu. Alla prosexo. Hold forth your nous, which of two he might seem to you, either recollecting or learning from me. I will indeed hold forth. The demonstration is supposed to show that learning is through recollection, but the two alternatives here are recollecting with no mention of learning, or learning from Socrates. Learning from a teacher is precisely what Meno is used to, because for him, learning requires teaching. The sophist teaches, the pupil learns. And now the recollection alternative isn't referred to as learning at all. There's a danger, therefore, that Meno might conclude that the slave is recollecting and not learning. But the demonstration is supposed to show that recollecting is learning. Why does Socrates keep setting up things to fail? Without looking ahead to what actually does happen, we may imagine that if Meno sees that Socrates doesn't teach the way a sophist teaches, then the slave isn't learning, because learning was the second alternative Socrates gave. Therefore, the slave, if the slave does acquire some knowledge here, is obviously recollecting, but not learning. This is not a demonstration that recollection is learning, precisely because Socrates hasn't connected recollection with learning in this choice that he's just given Meno. Socrates now turns to Meno's attendant. Epede moi o pai. Well then, tell me, child. The demeaning term child is used to address slaves, whether male or female, and of any age. Now we do know that this member of Meno's household is male, but we don't know what age he is, and it may or may not be correct to consider him a boy. He is more probably a young man, probably about the age of Meno. I say that because then we would have some dramatic balance. We have Meno on the one hand and the slave on the other hand, both learning or failing to learn in Meno's case. When referring to this person, therefore, we should call him a slave and not a slave boy. It would have been ideal if Socrates could have talked to a baby. That's the nearest we could get to a human with no opinions or knowledge. The older the slave, the less excuse Meno has for not objecting immediately that the slave already possesses knowledge from this life. The other point to notice in Socrates' first address to the slave is that he begins with epe moi, tell me, and telling is something Meno really likes. Meno keeps asking Socrates to tell him things, so let's see what Socrates wants the slave to tell him, E pede moi o pai gignoskes tetragonon chorion hotitoiuton estin? Ego ge? Well then, tell me, O child, do you know that a four-angled area, that it is such? I do. From now on, instead of four-angle, I'll say rectangle, which is not the same thing, but we are talking about rectangles. What rectangle is Socrates talking about? Is it one in the soul of the slave? No, he's evidently drawn a rectangle, probably in the sand, using a stick. It's interesting that Plato doesn't feel the need to spell this out, for example, by having Socrates ask yet another slave to bring him a stick so that he can draw in the sand. Evidently, Plato wants his readers to use their own imagination. We see similar mental exercises in other dialogues as well. For example, at the beginning of Book 7 of Republic, Politeia, Socrates asks Glauco to imagine a cave, and then Socrates describes to him the cave. Glauco and most people ever since have failed to imagine the cave Socrates describes. It's an impossible cave, especially with regard to the shadows of the prisoners looking at the cave wall. But that's another dialogue. Socrates had asked the slave to tell him something, but it turns out that all he wants to know is whether the slave knows what a rectangle is, or rather that he knows that a rectangle is such a thing, obviously, as this, and Socrates draws a rectangle. So Socrates is not only showing Meno, but is showing the slave as well, but showing different things, or purportedly different things. He's not showing the slave what he's showing Meno. He's showing the slave a rectangle, and he's showing Meno that anamnesis, recollection, is the only way people learn. He has actually already failed in proving that recollection is the only way that people learn, because the slave is not an empty vessel. He already knows what a rectangle is. He has some knowledge, in addition to Greek and other things that he must have known already. Socrates could claim that this is that small piece of knowledge from which the slave can recall other things as well, because all things are connected in nature. He did go to the effort of saying that during the account of recollection. That very premise, however, already ruins the theory of recollection, because really there's no reason why you should begin with a piece of knowledge. How do you get to that one piece of knowledge if all of knowledge is in the soul and none in the head of the human? As we noted last time, the slave does not represent someone who knows nothing and everything at one and the same time. He represents all human beings who have some knowledge, and because of that knowledge they can acquire other knowledge. This is how learning actually takes place. We should also remember that Socrates has further confused the issue with his two options whereby there is recollection or learning. This may simply be to make it easier for Meno to choose recollection. He would have a problem if he had to choose between two methods of learning. Notice that the slave is very confident in his answer. He really does know that a rectangle is like that. The diagram that Socrates draws is evidently a square, so he may be asking, do you know that there is a particular sort of rectangle which is like this, a square? Estin un tetragonon chorion isas echontas grammas tautas pasas teteras usas panuge. So there's a rectangle having all these lines equal, being 4. Absolutely. Ukai tautasi tas diamesu estin isas echon? Nay. Isn't it having these equal lines through the middle as well? Yes. Socrates has quartered the square, so there is now one big square comprising 4 smaller squares. Socrates, however, has been concentrating on the length of lines. All of these lines are equal. Uk un eie antoiuton chorion kai medzon kai elaton panuge. Therefore, such an area would be greater and lesser? Absolutely. By such an area, Socrates means a square, and we can see from the diagram he has already drawn that a square can be bigger, the big square, and smaller, the 4 squares making up the big square. They are smaller than the big square. All of this is something the slave can see. Socrates is showing him everything. We may suspect that the slave already knew about the relative sizes of squares from his previous experience, but not in previous lives. In this life, he must have seen squares. Even assuming that the slave has never thought about squares before now, he is now seeing that there are bigger squares and smaller squares, and in the account of recollection, it has already been said that the soul sees things. That is how it learns in the first place. It's because it's been eternal, it has seen everything in this world and in Hades. Seeing is the way the soul acquires its knowledge. If Meno had really been using his intellect here, he should have noticed that the slave could simply be learning about squares through seeing them, and he would then have objected that this does not prove the theory of recollection. Socrates might be disappointed, but he carries on with the demonstration next time.